Welcome back and thank you very much for staying with us. We are glad you're watching WION The World is One. This is a special broadcast in collaboration with Voice of America, American Joker. This year's gathering of leaders at the United Nations General Assembly is taking place in the shadow of Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, and as the war in Ukraine heads into a possibly decisive period. Voice of America's United Nations correspondent Margaret Besheer has more.
Queen Elizabeth's funeral on September 19th has presented logistical challenges for leaders attending the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Some speeches and meetings may have to be shuffled as they dash from London to New York. This year's meeting takes place at a time of great peril, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says.
Our world is blighted by war, battered by climate chaos, scared by hate, and shamed by poverty, hunger, and inequality.
Russia's war in Ukraine, which may be at a militarily decisive moment, is certain to dominate the annual meetings. The situation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is of particular concern.
We are playing with fire. We cannot continue in a situation when we are one step away from a nuclear accident. The safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is hanging by a thread.
Western officials, meanwhile, want to firm up support from some countries that may be wavering as the war grinds on.
Many African and Asian countries have security relationships with Russia or economic relationships with Russia. And while they were willing to criticize the invasion back in March, they don't want to keep on picking fights with Moscow at the UN.
But with Russian President Vladimir Putin not attending the annual gathering, he rarely does, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's participation uncertain, no breakthrough is expected.
But I have no illusions that at the present moment the chances of a peace deal are minimal.
Russia and Ukraine are important food producers, and their war has worsened a global food crisis. Supply chain disruptions and rising food prices are exacerbating the situation in the Horn of Africa, which is suffering its worst drought in 40 years. As many as 20 million people are at risk of severe hunger, and famine is looming for nearly 8 million people in Somalia.
The famine is real, and it's happening.
President Joe Biden is expected to lead a high-level meeting on global food security, one of several sessions to tackle the issue. The Secretary General just returned from Pakistan, where deadly floods have submerged one-third of the country. He would like to see climate action high on leaders' agendas.
What is happening in Pakistan demonstrates the sheer inadequacy of the global response to the climate crisis and the betrayal and injustice at the heart of it.
This is the first time that leaders will participate fully in person at the General Assembly since 2020, the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has moved from the spotlight as leaders grapple with more pressing issues. Margaret Besheer, VOA News, the United Nations.
Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone is now joining us live with analysis from Washington, D.C. Hi, Jessica. Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the SCO summit in Uzbekistan. What are officials in the United States gleaning from this, and what does the meeting say about the, evolution of Sino-Russia relations?
Well, I think like many observers, U.S. officials are honing in on that piece of the Russian video that was played where Putin says he understands Beijing's questions and concerns about the invasion of Ukraine. But the Chinese readout of that very same meeting makes no mention of those concerns or even what they could be. Still, we did get a little bit of a hint at China's discomfort with the instability being caused by that war, where Xi Jinping is quoted as saying, quote, he's asking Putin to play a guiding role to inject stability and positive energy into the world. Now, some here are reading that as an acknowledgement by Moscow that Beijing doesn't view the current war in Ukraine as a stabilizing influence. And what analysts say we are seeing is Putin's effort to really demonstrate that he is fully in Beijing's corner. He talked about Taiwan during the meeting and his support for China's One China policy. Also, congratulations to Xi Jinping on going into the Chinese People's Party Congress, where he's expected to win an unprecedented third term. And Putin also stressed that he sees the future of Western alternative world order as being formed on the back of the Sino-Russo relationship. And that's certainly turning heads here in Washington as well.
Let's move away from that, Jessica. And later today in Washington, President Joe Biden will host South African President Cyril Ramaphosa at White House. Tell us about that and how much of a strain has the differences over Ukraine caused on the relationship?
Well, we are seeing differences across the world between the U.S. position on this and other major countries, of course, and South Africa is one of them. Experts who spoke to VOA specifically about the South Africa-U.S. relationship, though, said they do really expect Biden to spend time today lobbying Ramaphosa to change his administration's position on condemning the war in Ukraine. You'll recall that South Africa abstained from doing just that at the United Nations earlier this year, and South Africa's foreign minister said earlier this week that Ramaphosa will press for a negotiated solution between Russia and Ukraine. We also understand he will do the same with Biden later today. Now, meantime, Congress is considering legislation to penalize countries who do trade with Russia under these circumstances. Obviously, the U.S. has imposed a number of sanctions, and that many of them are international sanctions, but we expect Ramaphosa at the White House to push back against those in his meetings later today with President Biden. Eric?
Jessica Stone, stay with me. Now, a bipartisan group of United States lawmakers met with Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen earlier this month. The latest show of support from the United States Congress to the island republic amid heightened tensions with China. VOA's congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson spoke with members of the delegation about U.S. security and economic support for Taiwan.
Renewed support for Taiwan as yet another bipartisan congressional delegation calls for deeper ties in the face of threats from China.
Our delegation, as with every congressional delegation that has visited, is a symbol of Congress's rock-solid commitment to Taiwan.
This latest visit follows Nancy Pelosi's historic trip last month, the first by a U.S. Speaker of the House in 25 years. A member of the latest delegation told VOA it is time for a change in the U.S. approach.
Our policy has always been strategic ambiguity instead of strategic clarity, but that was many, many years ago, 40 years ago almost. And what we need to look at is China has changed dramatically in that period of time. They were not nearly the significant military or economic power that they are today.
The Biden administration approved $1.1 billion in arms sales to Taiwan last week, a move that drew swift condemnation from China.
The U.S. arms sale to Taiwan blatantly violates the One China principle and the provisions of the 3 China-U.S. joint communiques, especially the August 17 communique, seriously undermines China's sovereignty and security interests, severely damages China-U.S. relations and peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and sends seriously wrong signals to the separatist forces of Taiwan independence.
But there is bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress for even more support of Taiwan, including closer ties in agriculture and trade.
They asked us to get involved in a free trade agreement. They would like an agreement with the United States, and that's something that we're going to be working on to see that we can do that. We also want to bring more balance. We'd like to see them trading more with us and sort of balance the trade.
A U.S. House panel heard testimony Wednesday that a new U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement and bringing Taiwan into the Trans-Pacific Partnership would play a crucial role in countering authoritarianism.
Taiwan is at the front line of this rivalry as Beijing intensifies political, military, and economic coercion against it as part of a broader strategy to subvert the island's democracy and compel reunification. The United States should aid Taiwan's efforts to defend its people, its democracy, and its freedoms. A U.S.-Taiwan BTA would serve that goal. It would demonstrate American solidarity with Taiwan's people and reward their success in cultivating strong democratic institutions, robust civil society, transparent and accountable government, and economic freedoms.
A key U.S. Senate committee also approved the Taiwan Security Act this week. If passed, it would provide $6.5 billion in security funding over the next 5 years. Catherine Gibson, VOA News, Washington.
VOA correspondent Jessica Stone is still with us. Jessica, legislators in the United States this week moved forward on a bill that would finance weapons exports to Taiwan for the first time. What does this vote say about changes to the U.S.-Taiwan relationship?
Well, we have certainly seen a hardening of the positions of those in Congress over the last 2 or 3 years against China in favor of supporting Taiwan in that specific military context. And we certainly saw that on display this week, as you saw there in Catherine's report. Congress also becoming much bolder in their bipartisan support for Taiwan since China's reaction with missiles and military drills after Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker's visit to Taiwan. But even before that, Congress was working on this Taiwan Policy Act, which increases military assistance to Taiwan to the tune of $6.5 billion. You heard Catherine mention that it had been proposed at $4.5 billion. They just added another $2 billion over this week, just showing you how they're sort of piling on, looking for a way to help Taiwan purchase more heavy weaponry that can help them defend themselves and deter Chinese aggression. Previously, Taiwan had to pay for its own weapons, so this is a big sea change in terms of that. The bill also has language allowing the U.S. to treat Taiwan as a major non-NATO ally. They're not using the language that they will label them as such, which is what caused the White House concern, but they say in this bill, as it stands currently, that they will treat Taiwan as a major non-NATO U.S. ally. And who's that? Japan, South Korea. So that's really elevating the diplomatic relationship. One co-sponsor of this bill calls it the most comprehensive restructuring of U.S.-Taiwan policy since 1979. The Chinese embassy agrees and calls it, quote, egregious.
Jessica, this week the White House took additional steps to crack down on other countries' theft of American intellectual property. In recent years, the United States has, focused on preventing U.S. technology transfer to China. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the president issued this executive order this week that allows, it really toughens national security review process, which is known as CFIUS, or the Council on Foreign Investment the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. They have a review process for any deal between a U.S. company and a foreign company. He is trying to add additional measures and considerations for that committee to look at. And what he's doing is he's asking them to add to their list of things to consider the impact on critical links in the American supply chain or American leadership in critical technologies, cybersecurity, or data privacy. And these were not previously explicit considerations for this committee. Of course, CFIUS has overwhelmingly been used in recent years to scuttle deals between Chinese and American companies or Chinese and European companies that operate in the United States. But the Treasury Secretary who leads this committee said in a statement this week, the executive order, quote, sharpens the committee's focus on protecting America's national security while maintaining the U.S. open investment policy. Eric?
Live from Washington, D.C., VOA correspondent Jessica Stone. Thank you.